Well, hey everybody, welcome to our series today. If you clicked on this, that means you have an interest in learning how you can better partner with the person speaking, giving the sermon during your service, at the end of the speaking, to really play behind them. I'm joined today by someone I genuinely consider like a top tier GOAT at this, Evan Fernald. So stoked to have him. Evan's gonna tell you a little bit about his background, but I'm gonna brag on him before he doesn't brag on himself because I know him and he wouldn't do that. But when it comes to all things piano, tracks, playback, MDing, this guy is super phenomenal. He's the music director at The Belonging. Evan Fernald, pumped to have you. Share a little bit more about who you are and your background in this entire world.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up, like I'm sure so many of us growing up playing in church as a kid. High school years, started like leading youth and all those things, and ultimately went into full-time worship ministry. My wife and I were worship directors for a number of years. Came to Nashville in about 2017, and since then I've just had an incredible opportunity to get to be a part of an amazing church and to get to play with some pretty incredible people in the worship field. So yeah, just super stoked to get to talk about this more today.
Yeah, oh man, it's gonna be great. So a little bit about what we're gonna be talking about today. Today, we're gonna start in part one talking about the toolbox, all the things that you can see up on here. We have a bunch of different toys and piano things that are going on. So we're gonna be talking about the tools and then the things that you do at home leading up to getting to service to really prepare you to be able to play behind your pastor well. But then also the things that are happening in service leading up to the moment before you even walk on stage. And so all of the technicalities, the sound, creating the sounds, all of those different types of things is what we're gonna cover in part one. And then in part two, we're gonna do some practical application. What does this actually look like now that we've done everything to prepare the sounds, to prepare ourselves for going up on stage? Now we're gonna talk about what does it look like to actually play it out. So to get part two, go ahead and click the link in the description, enter your email, and we'll send that over to you. But before we do that, let's jump into part one. Okay, so up here, we've got a spaceship going on a little bit. Some people might be looking at this. I know myself, when you first open it up, I had two responses. My first response was, whoa, that's a lot of, and then second response, cool stuff. So what do we got going on here?
So honestly, it's actually nothing too crazy going on. There just happens to be a bunch of buttons and knobs and things, but really the heart of the setup here is very intentional, but actually pretty simple. I'm mostly using the Nord for piano sounds. Okay. I have some software. I use Ableton to host my keyboard session. A lot of guys use MainStage, great option as well. Yeah. The cool thing about this is really all the tools that I'm using here exist in multiple platforms. MainStage, Ableton, Logic, like different places where you can use the same kind of tools. So it doesn't have to be specifically what's here, just whatever you have access to, you can probably get pretty close on your own. Basically, I have an iPad here. All this is doing is recalling patches. Okay. So I have different patches set up in Ableton. I run all of the Nord sounds into Ableton to process with a lot of the plugins I'm running as well. Some Keyscape pianos, Omnisphere for most of my pads and synths, some various reverbs and compressions, some waves, plugins. But again, nothing too crazy, just some compression, reverb, and a little bit of effects. I have a MIDI controller over here that just controls my volumes and filters, which is basically like an EQ adjustment for your pads and pianos. You can kind of like manipulate how it sounds, take it brighter or darker using EQ filters, and just some levels controlling some of the effects I have on the piano. That's essentially all that's going on here.
Man, that's so cool. And all of this, it's easy to see this and be like, okay, how do you do all of this? It's one of those things that once you start doing it, then it just kind of becomes almost like riding a bike of like, okay, this thing right here is all about, like you said, controlling the volumes and the filters. This is then these different types of things. It again gets to this place to where it's like when you show up on Sunday, everything's already pre-built so that you can focus on the main thing, and that's encountering and serving the encounter.
Yes, that really is huge, to be prepared on the gear side. Like, I don't want to be showing up and be distracted and pulled out of a moment because something's not working right. Like, oh, this is, all of a sudden I've got no piano. Why do I have no piano? I'm getting this weird buzz, and all of a sudden, like, this patch is 10 times louder than the last one. You know, right. All the things that can just pull you out of a moment and can distract literally the entire room, but then also distract my ability to be able to really stay locked into the moment and what's being spoken and what's being said and how I'm going to respond and kind of help, build a musical atmosphere
Yeah.
around that. So it really, really is worth every moment that you can just at home by yourself investing in it. Again, it doesn't have to be complicated or complex. Just be intentional and know that when you show up, it's going to work the way that it needs to work.
Yeah.
To allow you to then support, a distraction-free moment.
Yeah. And I know for some of you, the instrument that you're using on Sunday morning isn't what you own personally. It's at the church. And what I've seen has always been my situation. Anytime I've ever played keys, I'm always using the piano that's at church. The one that I have at home is a quality that should remain at home. But what I've done is there have been times where I've said, you know what? I want to be able to do exactly what you're saying, Evan. I want to show up on Sunday and fully focus on encounter, playing, supporting the moment, doing what I need to do in order to be able to fully focus on that without any other distractions. And so what I did is I built a similar type of approach, but then just programmed it with the piano that was at church and then just saved it. If there was ever any adjustments that needed to be made, a small tweak on a Sunday morning is much easier than there was, I think, like a 2-year time where I would show up on Sunday. I had routed everything on my setup at home, then show up on Sunday and I'm going through and I'm hitting dun dun, okay, assigning this to this controller because this is different than the one at my house, and literally taking like 30 minutes to try to assign everything almost in this frantic, chaotic mess.
Yeah.
During like everyone loading in and sound checking, majority of the time pushing back the beginning of the set. Sorry, Ben and Jonathan, for all the times that I did that, but like that type of thing. Whereas taking a little bit of time once to set it up right so that you can come in and have less things to worry about.
Yeah, and even having a conversation and partnering with, if you're not the worship director yourself or the worship pastor, even having a conversation with your worship pastor going, hey, is there like an afternoon that I could come in and just sit down with the keyboard? And a lot of keyboards out there, you can build a patch and save it.
Yeah.
So if there's like a patch they've been using, you don't have to get rid of anything that they've been using, but you go, hey, I would really love to be able to like invest some time in being able to utilize this more.
Yeah.
And I think you would probably find a lot of worship pastors would maybe welcome that, because a lot of it falls to them to have to try and figure out, great, now I got to figure out how we get a keyboard sound that these people can just walk in and use. Mm-hmm. And so they might be like, please come in and like, just don't delete anything that we're using. But like, I think you might find that that's something that you could take advantage of.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about the gear. Let's dive in a little bit into the different sounds that you have standing by and when you use each sound in each different environment. Because I'm looking on here at the different patches that you have, and you've got a piano, a wing upright, a Yamaha Grand, a Rhodes, all these different things. We talked about what this can do. Now let's talk about the different sounds that you are using to almost build the parfait. Shout out to the donkey and Shrek, the parfait.
Yeah, and honestly, a lot of this, my personality, I tend to be somebody that like over prepares for situations that oftentimes might never actually happen. So I'm like, I've got to have a good grand. I've got to have an upright. I've got to have another upright. I've got to have an actual layer between the upright and the grand, like just different textures.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, I'm using the same piano sound. I'll land on one for a season and kind of, oh, this is cool, this is fresh, I'll use this for a while.
Yeah.
And then that'll kind of get tired for me, like, all right, cool, let's try something else. So most times I've got a go-to piano sound, I've got a go-to pad sound, and that's what I'm hanging out on. So these are just there partly just because, I've added them into the session at some point, whether it was for a song, and I was like, this might be cool to leave in the session.
Yeah.
So I basically have the Nord upright just by itself, the Nord Grand just by itself. I can turn the organ section on or off, so I can just layer that into the piano send. That's something we'll talk a little bit more in terms of like blending your sounds. You always want to be aware of that you're not like all of a sudden blowing your front of house mix engineer out by like rocking the B3 down your piano lines, and he's like,
going to the organ, turn it down.
Yeah, so an awareness thing, sensitivity thing there, because it does share the same outputs as the piano for my setup, so I'm aware of that. And then the next row is a lot of the keyscape sounds. I've got the Rhodes, the wing upright, the Yamaha C7, and like an EP piano sound. So they're just different textures that if it feels like I want something a little softer. I can do that a couple different ways. I can either I've got a knob that's mapped to the filters on my piano, so I can like filter the piano back to kind of take some of that really top end energy down.
Yeah, so that's an EQ thing?
It's an EQ thing, so you take all like the kind of upper range of the frequency spectrum and carve it out. So you end up with a darker, mellower sound, not as bright, like transient attack notes. And kind of throw that through some reverb and just kind of get like this kind of washy, dark chord
Yeah,
vibe.
cool.
And so I can actually go to a Rhodes sound. That sound by itself is already kind of darker and warmer.
Yeah.
So it's a different way to kind of get a darker sound and vibe. Occasionally, I'll use a Rhodes kind of in the context we're talking about, blended with a pad.
Yeah.
Usually, though, I'm using a piano, one of the piano models that I've got, and kind of playing with filter and effects, which we'll dive into a little bit later.
Cool. So now what we're gonna do is, Evan, I want to kind of think through. I want to do this well. I'm super interested in making a sound, setting up my setup in a way to where everything that you're talking about is cohesive, complements the moment that we are in. Maybe let's go through and build a sound together for an environment in a moment like this.
Yeah. So we can just start with, this is just the basic Nord grand piano.
Yeah.
This is the white grand. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Typically what you'll find on just kind of a stock piano on a lot of keyboards is there might not be a ton of sustain. It might be really bright,
Yeah.
pretty dry. And so what we want to do is a couple different tricks is we're going to add some compression,
Okay.
which is going to help with sustain. It's going to help tame some of the really bright attack moments. If you really do start digging in, it doesn't get out of control.
Yeah.
For your front of house engineer, which they'll love you for. One other way to do that, if you're running any software instruments, or in my case, I'm actually sending the MIDI into Ableton and then back into the Nord.
Whoa.
So I'm able to manipulate the MIDI that's coming back into the Nord that triggers the sound. And so there's a lot of plugins that if you run full velocity, so if you allow the full velocity of the keyboard to come through, it can get really, really harsh on the top end. So a lot of software programs like Ableton, Mainstage, they'll have a little MIDI utility that lets you limit the maximum velocity that comes back to that sound. And so you can find a sweet spot that still gives you some dynamics that you can really dig in, but it again tames that top end from really getting out of control. So I'm going to do a couple things.
That
I'm
just blew my mind.
a trick I learned from Incredible Engineer, and he literally would be on the phone with me back in our live stream room, and I'd be hammering the keyboard. He'd be less, less, less. And I'd be dialing the velocity max down, and we'd find a spot. He goes, right there, that's
right
it.
There. That's sweet.
And so it lives there.
Oh, I literally have moments in my mind of playing in church, behind the pastor, exactly what we're talking about, where it was oh no, I just hit the key a little too loud.
Too much, yeah. And everything we're talking about, for the most part, they're subtle changes. There's no one step along this way that's going to be this dramatic, huge thing.
Yeah.
And it's the combination of a bunch of subtle things that ultimately land you in kind of a great spot. So I usually run just a little bit of the compressor.
Okay.
Just enough that when I really dig in, you can start to see the light activate. So you know that compression is just hitting a little bit. That just takes the first little edge off. I'm going to turn that MIDI utility on that limits the velocity. And then I have a chain on my main output for my pianos that has some additional compression. It has the filter, which is that EQ adjustment. I have a send that I can send into some delay and some reverb.
Sweet.
To kind of enhance the sound as well. The main output chain, compression is probably one of the big things that it's adding, which again kind of gives you more sustain, more fullness. And so we're going to go ahead and add some of that in here. With the delay, I usually try to have it enough in the mix that it's kind of adding some additional hits, which adds some sustain. The delay also goes into the reverb. So then you're hitting that reverb with some additional delay hits.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily, unless I'm playing a lead line that really wants this subdivision delay, syncopation happening, I don't necessarily want to hear those delay hits.
Yeah.
So it's a subtle enhancement that just kind of helps add an extra little vibe to it.
You're not using it like a guitar player uses a delay pedal.
No, not in this context.
Yeah.
My thought with it sometimes is I should hear it if it goes away, but not necessarily so audible that every time I play a note you're hearing
gong, gong, gong.
Yeah, so just to kind of exaggerate it here, if you're getting this way too much. Way too much. That's not what we're after in this context. So we're just gonna add a little bit, feather it in.
Yeah.
So that delay, a little bit of reverb, some compression.
Cool.
And the idea with it, and even with the pad, is I want to be able to fill space without necessarily having to like keep hammering notes.
Yeah.
You know, like if you get rid of some of that processing, I have to keep playing for there to continue to be sound. And then that just starts to feel busy and not intentional.
Especially with someone talking.
Especially with somebody talking, because there's a very real thing. I worked for a pastor years ago that intentionally he wanted simple playing behind him. And I honestly would probably be the exact same way if I'm up on a microphone and somebody's back behind me just going to town. I'm going to be very distracted. And different speakers, different pastors are different. Some people are not distracted at all by that, but it's the sensitivity I want to have to my pastor, to whoever is on the mic. Like, am I playing too much for you? I don't want to distract you from your moment. So it's very valuable to have sounds that can fill a space with just minimal interaction.
So good.
And then I have the ability to kind of dial some of those effects, like the delay and the reverb back, if I want to start playing more, to keep it from then kind of, exponentially getting away from me and then adding too much. So I can dial it back and start to play more notes, and it still is controlled. So,
and I love that you have these controls available to you right here to make adjustments live, because there have been times where I've been playing and I'm realizing as I'm playing, this sounded really cool whenever I was practicing at home, but then the moment that I get into the live setting, I realize this delay is way too hot, and then I'm doing the whole, hand on the piano with one hand over here on the laptop and just doing the whole laptop squint type of thing. Whereas having it right here allows you to be able to dial, but also it allows you to be able to add and adjust in a way of, this is perfect for this moment, but as we're building, I want to add a little bit more. One thing that I know that you do as well is there are additional pads going on in addition to your playing that you have control of. Talk about that a little bit, the drone and stuff like that.
Drone, you might hear it called an infinite pad.
That's a great name.
I know, it's like this, it's just this, basically, it's a pad that just kind of hangs out on whatever key you're in. You might hear like a 1-5-1 reference, which is basically the notes of the scale. So it's kind of hanging out on, so if we're in the key of C, a drone might be C, G, C. It's just kind of that octave with the G in the middle. It doesn't necessarily create a major or a minor or a chord progression, but allows you to play in this key any chord progression, and this just kind of gives you a pad base to kind of play with. So I have a channel set up that has different audio samples set up to basically do that in any key, and I have a page on my iPad that I can fire any key drones wise. So this would be what that would sound like.
So it's automatically playing once you hit this
As soon as I play that, yes. And there's settings, again, there's a universal thing, whatever software you're using, keyboard you're using, there's settings called attack and release. Attack is how fast that sound's going to come in, and release is how slowly or quickly it's going to go away. And so you can finesse those settings to make it come in, fade in nice and smooth. And then in my case, if we're going to change keys, the release setting is set to complement the attack setting, so that as the second key is coming in, the first key is fading out. So that would basically sound a little bit like this. So if we're going from the key of C to the key of F, so it's very smooth, and I don't have to necessarily be manipulating a bunch of knobs myself. I've just taken time to like dial some settings to where all I have to do is press the new key, and the computer's going to take care of the rest. So I'm not having to think about that. So that's very useful, especially if you maybe don't necessarily have a really great pad sound, because you can get audio samples of drones and infinite pads. You can download them. So many people make those available. There's so many great resources for that. So you can even play those from a headphone jack on an iPhone. There's apps that do it, and then you can just play piano behind that, and that can give you a really great base to kind of work with.
That's great. We actually have some of those different drone pad infinite loop sounds that we've made available to you for free. That's going to be linked in our description. So everything we've talked about is the different setup to get us to the point. Really, if we're thinking through the lens of everything that we've been talking about right now, we're at home. We're in our bedroom, our studio, our office, whatever you want to call it. And we've been getting everything ready so that we can show up on Sunday morning. And that's kind of where our mindset and everything has been thus far to get us prepared for that. So you talked a little bit about the drone pad. Let's jump into pads in general, because I know you're also playing pads in addition to having maybe a drone infinite pad going on at the same time. What do you look for in a pad how should I approach pads? Because that's a whole thing in and of itself as well.
Sure. Well, I think for the context of especially playing at the end of service, I want something that's going to, again, fill space. I'm going to avoid creating a sound that just gets super bright and just huge and epic, like
killer shimmer.
Yeah, just like it gets way out of control. So I'm going to create something that is maybe going to live on the darker end, on the more mellow side, that can fill the space, but maybe have the ability to kind of brighten it up if the band does start to come in and we're kind of going into a song after the message. So again, like I have pretty much a main pad sound that I use most of the time, and using a filter, again, that EQ control, I can darken it, or I can open it wide open, let all that top end energy through, and it can get a lot brighter. But one of the main things that I think we should be conscientious of is, again, those same settings that we talked about, attack and release on a synth. It's the same thing, where how quickly is that chord going to come in when I play the notes, and how quickly is it going to go away when I play new notes. You want that to be, again, complementary, so that as I'm playing a chord progression, it doesn't get super muddy. If the release is too long, then that first chord is going to bleed over into the second chord. If it's too short, you're going to have really abrupt chord changes. You're going to feel like the pad dropping out in between every chord. So you're going to want to find those settings, and they're in every keyboard that produces a synth sound is going to have these settings in them, whether it's keyboard, software, any of it. So you can kind of dig around and find where that's at and whatever you're using, and play around with those attack and release settings to find a nice smooth chord transition. And it's even super helpful. I have a knob that will affect those settings in my setup.
Oh, cool.
And again, it's a subtle thing, but if I turn the knob all the way, then it's going to make those changes slower. So I can play slower chord changes. It's it's a less defined chord change. But if I were to start to try and play faster chord changes, it would really get weird. So then I can turn that knob back down, and I have faster attack and release times. So kind of even thinking with that in mind, of going, I want maybe a slower attack and release just for kind of that ambient playing. Then I want to be able to speed it up if we start going into something with a faster tempo. Super helpful. And reverbs are a big, huge friend of yours with pads. That's one of the ways you can get a sound sounding really big. Reverbs also have decay settings, so that will work alongside the attack and release setting of the synth. So it's sometimes even finding the balance between the synth setting and the reverb setting to kind of give you that smooth chord change.
And so decay is kind of like the release.
Exactly.
Cool.
How long that reverb is going to take to kind of die out.
Man.
So one other thing that I think is important is if you're playing piano and pad together, so not just necessarily playing piano over a drone. That might look a little bit different. But if you're actually playing piano and pad layered together, that influences how you can play. Because with pads, if you start to add too many notes together in voices, it starts to get really muddy. And so if I'm actually playing, let's bring on a pad in here really quick here. So let's say I'm playing a pad, bring a piano in, and then I start going. Like you just start adding all this stuff. The pad can get really muddy and out of control. Usually for me, when I'm playing both of them layered together, I'm being a little bit more careful and intentional about like the chord voicings. I want it to be something that's pleasing for the pad to be sustaining.
Cool.
So if I am adding any kind of dissonance in the chord, then I want it to be something that if I were to hold that for a couple bars, it's still going to sound pleasant. I'm going to probably play simpler piano things. Those leading melodies that kind of lead in. I might kind of put those a little bit later in the phrase so that they lead into the chord rather than. It's like if you're adding all the notes and then letting them just hang for a while, there's more of a chance that you're going to get these weird big chord pad voices that aren't necessarily pleasant. That's just something to keep in mind. If I'm not actually playing a pad and I just have a drone going, then that kind of changes the dynamic of what I can do on piano. I can actually do a lot more. bunch of pad voices to the mix that's going to muddy it up.
Yeah.
So those are just two things to be aware of in your playing.
Yeah. Oh man. And in that, like, as I'm thinking about the different dynamic moments of when we play these different types of things, what you're just playing right there, I'm like, man, that's a perfect, super intimate moment going on. Having that drone just kind of setting that light thing and then playing on top of it is a beautiful, like, I'm thinking practical application when you do that. I'm going to go home and I'm going to practice that exact line. Yeah. There's something that I've seen on different performance programs where you can do what are like zones or split different areas. Share a little bit about that too.
Yeah, that's a great way to kind of address the same thing, because with pads, the higher up you play, sometimes those additional voices become more obvious.
Yeah.
And so something that I have set up, and it's really helpful, is you can have your pad stop at a certain point in your keyboard, and then the piano can continue all the way to the top. So that way, if I were to go up and start playing some higher piano notes, I'm actually not playing pad.
Because it's deactivated.
It's deactivated
from here up.
Here up. And that's one thing that I actually really love about some of the software that I'm using, is it actually allows you to gradually taper that off. So rather than it being a hard stop, I can actually start maybe say at this G. And so the higher that I go up, so from this G to this G, they're just going to be incrementally quieter. And then once I hit this G, it's not going to be playing pad at all. So it's a little bit more of a subtle way to gradually taper off the top into your pad to allow you to kind of play some more higher piano notes.
Yeah, so cool. It's all like fun, almost like it feels like cooking. Like they complement. How does this thing work together as opposed to just on its own? So then, what do you look for? Just in general in a pad sound, like what are some, because I know whenever I open up MainStage, or say you've opened up MainStage or you've opened up Omnisphere, and it's like, welcome to our library of 8,000 sounds. Congratulations, we've done this beautiful thing. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what do I do? What are like some typical things, maybe even key words that you look for that are like, oh yeah, like if I see something that says, Oberheim or Juno or whatever it might be, like what are some things to maybe pay attention to?
Those were a couple of great words.
Yeah. Those, next.
You hit those, yeah. Well, and that is a thing. There's a lot of synths that have that generate their own sounds. The synth has an engine called an oscillator that produces kind of the raw synth sound. You take that, manipulate it, and build stuff. And then there's basically a sample-based sound where they've taken another piece of hardware, typically a really nice synthesizer, run it through a bunch of cool stuff, recorded that sound, and then loaded it into the plugin or software, and lets you reproduce that. So samples would be maybe a great place to start, because a lot of that work is probably already done for you, because they've created it and just kind of given it to you to use.
Yeah.
So looking for something that's like a Juno-based sample would be a great thing to look for. If you're actually building a sound from scratch, you can do a lot with, you'll see like a saw wave.
Yeah.
It's like a type of synth wave to kind of create a sound. That's usually pretty versatile. You can kind of come up with a cool pad sound using that, as opposed to you might see like square waves, sine waves, other things like that, which are also very usable, but as far as just out of the box, I'm going to start playing around with a synth. Saw wave would be a great place to start and start playing around.
Yeah, man. Also, we have a series that we did on how to build a pad sound. We also have our own pad sounds on our site as well. All of that, like the drone that I mentioned earlier, is all linked in the description. And so really, this is the full sound. We have the piano, the pad, the additional things going on. We've talked about the importances of delay, reverb, attack, release, decay, all those different types of things. Now, really, that we have the ingredients, now we're putting the meal together for the specific context that we are in. And a huge part of that is something that you mentioned earlier about learning your pastor. And I remember one of the first times that I ever started playing at church, initially when I first started playing, a lot of what I played was just like, okay, the next song we're going into is No Other Name by Hillsong, so I'm just going to play the chorus chords over and over again, and the first, the third, and the fifth of each chord, and just going up and down. And then I slowly was learning a few different songs, and I remember this moment when I learned a song that a band called Bon Iver did a cover of by Bonnie Raitt called I Can't Make You Love Me. And the sound of that song, just the way they play it, is so emotional and so like, it just tugs on my heart. And so I decided, okay, well, like, that's beautiful. I'm in the key of C. Maybe I'll play that here. And so I get on stage and I'm just like playing through that. I'm not playing the line or anything like that, but just very much playing the chord phrasing. and trying to match my pastor that was speaking. Probably 5 minutes into it, he starts telling the story, wrapping up the sermon about something that he went through in his childhood that obviously was very emotional, and it's a big part of his story. And I'm playing this really emotional sound. And in the middle of him talking, he turns around and kind of looks at me and he's like, Josh, that's making me cry. You can't play that. And I like start laughing. The church starts laughing. I'm like, oh, ha, 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 ha. Ba-da-da. Keep playing it, just thinking that, that was just a funny statement. And a few seconds later, probably 30 seconds later, again, looks at me. He's like, dude, seriously, you got to stop playing that. And again, I'm just laughing and thinking like, oh, I'm just going to keep playing this because it's the one song I know besides 135. Yeah. And then he looks at me for a third time and he's like, you really have to stop playing that. I need you to play something else because I can't speak.
Yeah.
And in that moment, there was like a funny moment where that happened. It went off and, ended up going to the 135 and ending the service. But in that moment, I learned something and became aware of something that really we have to be intentional with. Is what I'm playing complementing the style of the person that's speaking, but also is it complementing what the Spirit is up to in that moment?
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about in part 2, is everything that you can do to learn your pastor, to sense what's going on in the moment, and then from that showing up and playing that well is really what we're going to dive into. And so for that, for part 2, there's a link in the description that you can click. Click on that link to get part 2, enter your name and email, and we'll send that to you. Let's go ahead and jump into that second part. We'll see you there.